Moving on, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has now ordered the construction of 800 Jewish houses in West Bank. The project has been given a go-ahead during the final days of the Trump administration. The move comes days before U.S. President-elect Joe Biden is set to be inaugurated on January 20th. Netanyahu's office announced that about 800 homes would be built in the settlements, but no starting date has been specified. Palestinians have condemned the construction, calling it illegal.
ما يقوم به رئيس حكومة الاحتلال نتنياهو في سياق محاولة تثبيت الوقائع على الأرض والعطاءات الاستيطانية الاستعمارية غير الشرعية وغير القانونية، وإعلانه اليوم عن هذه 800 وحدة استيطانية استعمارية يشكل مزيد من تصعيد العدوان والإجرام ضد الشعب الفلسطيني. نحن نعتبر كل الاستيطان الاستعماري غير الشرعي وغير القانوني هو يحاول استباق الوقت واستغلال هذا الوقت بعد الانتخابات الأمريكية وقبل أن يتم تسليم الإدارة الجديدة في سياق محاولته لفرض هذه الوقائع.
Moving ahead with the project could help shore up support for Netanyahu from settlers, and the Trump administration has backed Israel to build settlements in West Bank by abandoning a long-held position that they break international law.
הבנייה והאחריות לבנות את הארץ שלנו, בדיוק כמו האחריות על הביטחון ועל הכלכלה, היא של הממשלה שלנו. יש דיאלוגים חשובים עם מדינות רבות, כמובן ארצות הברית שהיא ידידה חשובה של ישראל, וישראל גם ידידה חשובה של ארצות הברית. זה צריך להשאיר לראש הממשלה ולהשאיר לנשיא ארצות הברית. אזרחי ישראל מצפים שיתנו להם לחיות ולבנות ולהתפתח בצורה טבעית וברורה, והאחריות היא על ממשלת ישראל לעשות את זה. זה לא עניין של מדינות אחרות.
Trump grew closer to Israeli leaders and angered Palestinians by recognizing contested Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the U.S. embassy there. Most countries view Israeli settlements as violation of international law, and Israel disputes this view by citing historical, political and biblical links to the West Bank. And for more on this, we are now being joined by Jody Cohen, international affairs expert from Israel. Thank you so much for joining us. How do you see this move panning out? And Palestinians, as we just mentioned, and you must of course know, have condemned this move. How do you assess this?
So I think it's really important to have a look at the background when looking at this issue. And as you said, from the Palestinians' perspective, they see the lands of the West Bank as being potential lands for a future Palestinian state along with Gaza. From the Israeli perspective, Israel argues that it has historic security and legal claims to the West Bank. And in fact, they call this area of land by Judea and Samaria. And that refers to the historic name for this land, which was then taken over by Jordan and renamed the West Bank. And then in 1967, it was won back when Jordan attacked Israel in a war. Now, Israeli settlement communities, they make up 2% of this area. And in 2000 and 2008, Israel argues that it actually offers to give back the land of many of these settlements. And the Palestinian leadership rejected these offers of peace. And in 2005, Israel actually left Gaza and 4 large West Bank settlements and were hoping for peace in return, but instead got more terrorism. So that's the background, and that's an understanding of both sides, really, of this argument, to understand their perspectives.
All right, and as we just mentioned earlier, the timing of this move is under scrutiny as well, because the project has been given a go-ahead during the final days of the Trump administration. What can you tell us about that?
Right, so the announcement actually is concerning settlements for both Palestinian and Israeli communities. I think it's important to say that. And it comes also in the days after, within a short period of time after the murder of a lady called Esther Horgan, who was a mother of 6 who was out jogging and got murdered by a Palestinian terrorist. And Israel argues that Israel's response to terrorism is to build constructively. And Israel also argues that instead of the international community pressurizing Israel into not building homes, we're talking about apartment blocks, but that the international community should really be pressurizing the Palestinian leadership to come back to the negotiating table and also to stop making payments to terrorists. Now, as you said, this announcement has come in the days leading up to President-elect Biden taking over. And he has a strong understanding of Israel's security concerns. He's also known for being not supportive of settlement building. We've also got an Israeli election coming up, and it's important to note that the general consensus in Israel is that these are historic Jewish community areas. These are not lands that were supposed to be given up under the Oslo Accords understanding. And indeed, the US Peace Initiative has also agreed that Israeli building on these lands is not illegal, and that Area C of the West Bank will be designated to Israel in any future negotiations. But the hope is, particularly with the Abraham Accords and all these countries normalizing their relations with Israel, that pressure will be put upon the Palestinians as well as upon Israel to really return to the negotiating table and resolve these issues through negotiations.
Okay, but on that point, most countries view Israeli settlements as violation of international law. How do you assess the impact of that on the movement, on this move to construct Jewish houses?
Israel will continue to protect its security, number one, and it will continue to reach out to the Palestinians. And it will be interesting to see how Israel uses its new relationships with countries like UAE and Bahrain in those negotiations and bringing the Palestinians back to the table. It will also be interesting to see the impact that President Biden can have, because the Palestinian leadership has suggested a warmer relationship with President Biden than they have had with President Trump.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us with all those details. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.